Hannah and I had both been avoiding watching the news in the house since Sarah arrived home, nervous that something like the news of the red truck trailer stop would come on and our thoughts would betray us. All it took was one glimpse of that truck and I knew we wouldn't be able to help immediately thinking about that night. It was like having a gun to my head and watching a documentary about lions, but trying not to think about a lion, even for a moment, lest the trigger be pulled. The truth is, we had passed that truck stop 2 times that night. Once with a little girl buckled in the back seat, her lifeless head lolling around as the car hit bumps in the road, and once with nothing but silence and a queer sense of relief filling the car. It was the closest sign of civilization from where we had left Sarah, and would have been the first place anyone would stop if they had a teenage hitchhiker in the passenger seat with no memory of how she got there. The morning of the day Sarah showed up on our doorstep was when the short order cook had discovered a truck stop full of bodies. That was no coincidence. Sarah had been there, but what had caused her to kill those people? Had she been attacked? It's possible, but I don't think so. There were no signs of violence at all, at least according to the news. I would imagine if someone had attacked her, there would be either no body at all, or their body would be smeared across the walls. I really think that it boils down to 2 scenarios. Either Sarah had no control of what happened, or she had complete control and simply didn't care, like a child stomping in an anthill. Regardless of which way the door swings, it still leads to a room with a nuclear missile, and I've been sleeping right next door. I've been debating with myself for a while whether to bring the news of the red truck trailer stop up with Hannah. The secret feels as if it will consume me, but I fear it will be too much for Hannah to take. She was never as good at keeping secrets from Sarah as I was, and she had already been trying to keep an enormous one from breaking down the barriers in her mind. But if something is to be done about Sarah being around, and equally as dangerous as before, then I'm not sure I'm capable of carrying that burden alone. The answer, as it so happens, came to me this morning in the form of the newspaper. We don't subscribe to the newspaper, so when Hannah slid it across the breakfast table, I was a bit perplexed. "I found some pretty great coupons in here," she said, uncharacteristically. "You should give them a look at work later, and we can make a shopping list." Sarah was still in bed, but even still it was wise to continue to keep up the charade. "You got it," I said, finishing my coffee in 2 gulps and grabbing my bag. "I'm gonna head out now." I kissed Hannah and left the house quickly, knowing that the longer I stayed there, the more likely my curiosity would seep through the thin veneer of my thoughts. Knowing that the longer I stayed there, the more likely the curiosity would seep through the thin veneer of my thoughts about work and what to do for lunch later. Drove down the street and parked in the gas station a few blocks away. I had a half hour before I needed to be at work, so there was plenty of time to read whatever Hannah was trying to get me to read. I was about to look for the coupon section, thinking she'd give me a clue, but as it turns out, what I needed to read was on the front page. Experts believe series of unexplained deaths may be connected. Many have long suspected a connection between the recent series of unexplained deaths, starting with those individuals at the red truck trailer stop, and most recently occurring yesterday in the case of Robert Sullivan. But it wasn't until yesterday evening that representatives from the FBI officially announced that they are researching possible connection between these deaths. Including the 8 victims of the red truck trailer stop, there have been over 20 deaths that have baffled both police and medical examiners. If there had been any identifiable cause of death, FBI Representative Todd Hull states, "We would have entertained the possibility of a mentally ill individual or a group of individuals harming the public. Right now, we are researching the possible likelihood of a connection between these deaths and urge the public to contact local medical professionals immediately with any unexplained changes in mood, activity level, awareness level, diet, and so forth. This does not appear to be related to the drinking water nor an airborne contaminant, but I assure you we are exploring every possible avenue." Hull further urges the public to be vigilant and pay close attention to loved ones. Probably the most baffling part of the whole case is the lack of public engagement. Hull says, "Not a single victim has been reported to police by close friends or family for several days. I cannot stress enough that vigilance is key to ensuring the safety of ourselves and our loved ones." Hull, of course, is referring to the fact that each death has been reported only by neighbors or passerby. Authorities have reported family and close friends acting shocked by the news of the death of their loved ones, even though those loved ones may have been in plain sight for several days prior to a wellness check by police. As I read this article, I felt as if my head was floating underwater. Sarah hadn't stopped at the truck stop, and now it seemed as if her reach was even further than it was 3 years ago. Robert Sullivan, Bob as I knew him, lived 10 miles away on the other side of town. There, sitting in the gas station parking lot with the newspaper sitting across my lap and steering wheel, I began to cry. The night we killed our daughter is one that would be forever branded in my mind. Each night afterward, As I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep, I would replay those events over and over, reliving the darkest, most shameful moment of my life. I would remember the weight of Sarah's lifeless body in my arms, the weight of my own heart as I carried her from the car, and I would silently weep. Hannah and I needed months of careful planning before we could make our move, which proved to be significantly difficult, because we couldn't even think about what we were going to do, lest Sarah discover our secrets. Every morning as I drove to work, I would finally get the chance to think about how I would take my daughter's life. Every evening as I drove home, I would work to push those thoughts from my brain and replace them with thoughts of how work went and whatever songs were on the radio. It was especially difficult to plan with Hannah, because she was around Sarah more, and I knew she struggled more than I did when it came to keeping secrets from her. We couldn't talk about it unless we were out of the house together, which happened very seldom for fear of what Sarah might do if left to her own devices. It was around that time that Hannah started singing. She always hummed to herself while she did dishes or folded laundry, but lately it seemed like every breath she took was one song. It was beginning to get annoying, because she always sang the same 3 songs. Over and over it was either What I Like About You, Every Rose Has Its Thorn, or Talk Dirty to Me. It got to a point where I found myself singing these songs too whenever I was in the shower or driving in the car. It was during one of these morning commutes, singing about a cowboy sad song that I couldn't get out of my head when it finally hit me. Poison. One of the most surefire ways Hannah had been able to keep Sarah out of her mind was by keeping a song stuck in her head. I'd assumed that had been why she started singing more, but I hadn't noticed until that moment that all 3 songs were by an 80s band called Poison, a group I knew Hannah didn't listen to. That night when I got home, I put my theory to the test by singing Rue Rollins' song my mother used to play, We Understand Each Other. Hannah didn't know the song, but the moment I got to the chorus, her eyes snapped up so quickly I thought she had certainly given herself away. I quickly glanced at Sarah, careful to keep my mind on the song. She was sitting quietly on the couch, staring at the window into the night sky. She did that more and more often those days, like she was somewhere else entirely. She would spend hours in such a position, staring at nothing but the blank space between her face and the window. I'd often wondered how cognizant she really was of her surroundings, but didn't dare allow myself to think she was anything less than completely aware. It was through that method that Hannah and I hatched our plan. It was early spring. The days had finally begun to get longer, but that day felt like the longest of all. I went to work, Sarah to school, and Hannah to spend the day running errands. Hannah and I met at lunch for dinner around the corner from my office. I ordered a tomato soup and BLT, and Hannah had a tuna melt. We talked about the grocery list and Sarah's upcoming math test, putting on a show for anyone that might remember us later, although there were very few people in that diner that afternoon, and fewer still within earshot. That was partially why I'd chosen that diner. The other part was because I knew the security camera in the corner wasn't working, so there would be no record of Hannah carefully sliding a small envelope across the table concealed by her palm. The envelope contained a white powder I understood to be midazolam, a potent sedative. The neighbor Hannah had gone to see while I spoke with Bob, Tammy Howell, had a nurse friend with low morals who had been able to procure a pill here and there from Tammy when she asked. It had only taken a phone call and a couple weeks before the drug was in our possession. I had been hoping for something stronger, but was assured this would do the trick, especially since this powder had once been in the form of those 10 pills prior to Hannah crushing them up. Far more than would ever be used for a single dose. With that kind of dosage, I imagined any sedative would do the job. A few hours later, I was parked in the garage. Next to me sat 2 greasy paper bags and a cardboard carrier with 3 milkshakes. Under normal circumstances, one of those bags would have been opened with half of the fries gone. But that night, they sat untouched. What little I had eaten during lunch had come up a few hours later, and the thought of eating anything sickened me. Inside the bag were 3 burgers, each wrapped in foil and held together by a label to identify contents. I had the bacon jalapeno burger, Hannah had the chicken sandwich, and Sarah had her favorite bacon cheeseburger with extra pickles. The sticker had made things a little more difficult than I'd hoped, but with patience I had been successful in peeling it back enough to slide the sandwich free and sprinkle about half of the envelope's contents in the middle. The rest had gone into her chocolate shake. Of course, I couldn't think of these things though as I sat in the garage, just about how rough work had been and wondering if I had come down with something or if I just had acid reflux, which would give me an excuse later if I couldn't keep dinner down. I put a smile on and carried the food in as I walked through the door. Hannah met me at the door, kissed my cheek, and thanked me for picking up dinner. Hannah set the table and began dividing up the contents of the bag while I approached Sarah's bedroom. I rapped on the door 3 times as always. "Hey, hun. Dinner's here," I said. Nothing but silence answered me. I had been expecting this. Sarah seldom joined us for meals anymore. For weeks, we only saw her just before or just after school as she made a beeline between her bedroom and the front door. Every other moment was spent locked in her room, presumably reading. I hadn't allowed myself for a moment to think that Sarah was doing anything else for fear I might be right. What I hadn't been expecting was the sound of the door opening behind me. After I turned back, What I hadn't expected was the sound of the door opening behind me after I turned and started back towards the kitchen, and resigned to leave her food in front of her bedroom door like always. Silhouetted in the darkness, Sarah's bedroom light was never on, stood my daughter. She looked thin, pale, and her hair hung like thick, greasy ropes. She looked like nothing but an empty husk now, and for a brief moment I felt better about what would transpire. This thing in Sarah's body wasn't my daughter. She was a wolf in sheep's clothing. "Hey kiddo," I said. "Glad you decided to join us. I got your favorite, complete with a chocolate shake. 'Cause I don't know about you, but I've had a hell of a week." Sarah didn't respond with more than an empty stare. We ate in the most poignant silence of my life. Sarah didn't look up at us either, just ate the food in front of her with her head hovering closely above the plate. I wasn't sure when the last time I saw her eat was, but watching it now gave me chills. God, she ate like an animal. Her head snapped up at me as the thoughts slipped through the cracks in my mind. Grease and salt condiments were smeared across her face and hands. Hatred shot from her eyes like bullets. "Do you want a napkin?" I asked, attempting to sound casual but knowing I had failed even as the words came out. I was staring into the face of a hideous beast. The longer she stared at me, the less human she seemed. Her pupils had completely overtaken their irises, leaving nothing but black pools of tar amidst a sea of white. Her jaw jutted forward a bit in an unnatural way, and it wasn't until she smiled at me that I understood why. Her teeth were flat and shallow from months of being constantly ground together. The teeth alone were enough to send chills down my spine, but the way her mouth worked as she smiled, the muscles in her cheek and jaw tightening, the veins in her neck and forehead pushing against her skin like worms below the surface, that was enough for me to want to run. I passed her a napkin. I tapped the corner of my mouth to show her where she needed to wipe the ketchup from and return to finish my meal. The moment the food was gone, Sarah returned to her bedroom. Hannah and I exchanged the quickest looks, then began to clean up. I had read that my Dazzleam takes somewhere around half an hour to take effect, but we elected to give it an hour. As the hour passed, the strangest feeling of calm began to slowly trickle into the house. It was so foreign to me that I had wondered for a moment if I had eaten the wrong burger, and was now feeling the sedative take effect. But I knew in an instant that wasn't possible. The calm we were feeling wasn't calm at all. Not really, but the sense of danger being lifted from the house. We'd spent so many years under a dark blanket of doom and depression and fear that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be safe in my own home. It would seem that the drug had done its job. At the very minute the hour passed, Hannah and I were knocking at Sarah's door. "Sarah?" I called. No answer. Not that there would have been one anyways, but this time, there was no shuffling sound, no footsteps, nothing at all. I clenched my jaw, met Hannah's hopeful and horrified gaze, then opened the door. Our daughter sat on the floor, leaning limply against the wall. I thought about turning the light on, but thought better of it. It was best I saw as little as possible. In her lap sat the open shoebox Hannah had discovered, and between her lifeless fingers was the orange tail of a cat. It looked fresh. I knelt down and called her name again. "Sarah? Sarah, can you hear me? It's your dad." Nothing. I felt her neck for a pulse. Nothing. I laid her down and put my head over her mouth and nose, looking for the sound or feel of breath. Nothing. Finally, Hannah retrieved the stethoscope Tammy had lent her, and I used it to listen for her heartbeat. We needed to be sure. I stood up and sighed, and with that sigh came over decades worth of tears. Tears from the pet Sarah had taken, tears from the family Sarah had ruined, but mostly tears for the little girl who had once brought me my oil filter wrench when she heard it in my mind that I needed it. The little girl who had so much potential, but had been born into a world that would shun her, fear her, and hate her for what she could do. None of this had been her fault, but she'd had to bear it nonetheless. It wasn't fair. It had never been fair. I sobbed for a long time, holding my daughter's body in embrace. I hadn't dared while her heart still beat. Hannah sat next to me, sobbing into the nape of my neck. We cried until the wells ran dry, and there were no more tears left to express the depression, fear, regret, and relief we felt. The wells would fill again, though, and the tears would be back. But it was best that they left us at least for the next few hours. We still had work to do. Hannah carried Sarah to the car. She was disturbingly light, and I went to work on the window frame with the crowbar from the shed. Once I'd gotten the window pried open, I cleaned the wood and paint from the end of the crowbar and returned it to the shed. Behind me, Bob's grave face watched from the window. He met my eyes and I went back to examine my handiwork. Gave him the slightest nod of confirmation. He wiped the palm across his face, presumably to catch a falling tear, then closed the curtain. Hannah was already waiting in the car. Behind her, bundled in a blanket draped across her lap, sat Sarah's lifeless body. This had been something we talked about at length, and had been the topic of conversation several times when we found ourselves unable to speak plainly without fear of Sarah overheating. We had no idea how the medication would affect Sarah, nor did we know if killing her was even possible. So Hannah had the idea of buckling Sarah in the back seat. If she suddenly woke up, we would have a better story to tell her than if she woke up in a locked trunk. We drove in silence for 2 hours, passing the red trailer truck stop along the way, before we reached the point where the roads became trails. Then another hour as we forged our own trail through the desert. We drove until we finally found what we had been looking for. A distant mine shaft that hadn't been used in nearly a century after a cave-in took the lives of a dozen men. This wasn't the main shaft that usually saw its fair share of graffiti artists or ghost hunters, but one on the other side of the former compound that was seldom used because of how small it was. It was only large enough to fit shuttle equipment from the mine to the surface, but if a person was small enough, they could slide themselves down and never see daylight again. We hiked the distance from the car to the mine shaft, taking turns carrying Sarah in our arms, passing her back and forth as we climbed a few chain link fences marked with no trespassing signs. When we arrived, I took a final moment to say goodbye to Sarah and tell her how sorry I was for everything that happened to her. Hannah had already begun crying again, but I was able to choke out a heartfelt, "Goodbye, baby girl. I'll always love you." I kissed Sarah on the forehead. Hannah did the same. And with that, we bid farewell to our little girl forever. Or so we thought. The news of Bob's death weighed heavy on our minds since I first learned it, equally as heavy as the news of Tamara, Tammy Howell, that I learned a few days later. I recognized several of the other names in the news, including Mark Jarvis, Preston's father, Lawrence Marshall, Sarah's former math teacher, and Evelyn Gates, the mother of the girl who had suffered 2 broken legs after she stuck gum in Sarah's hair during lunch. If there was any doubt that Sarah was involved in these deaths, it was dashed last night. Hannah and I had just sat down to dinner when there was a knock at the door. I stood from where I sat at the table wondering who it could be, while Hannah sat quietly in the kitchen. Sarah was in her room where she'd been most of the afternoon, a plate of food just outside her bedroom door. I opened the front door and saw a nervous face of David Peterson, my neighbor from across the street, not elderly but approaching his twilight years, who had made a living for the past 2 decades as a business accountant. Complete with thick rimmed glasses and a pen in his breast pocket, David couldn't look the part better if he tried. "Hey Dave," I said, a bit bemused. "Everything alright?" "I actually came over to ask you that," he answered. There was a tremble in his voice I'd never heard before. "Sure. What's going on?" He swallowed, searching for the right words. "Well, I've been meaning to come over and make sure that you and Hannah were doing alright." He held up a plate of brownies I hadn't noticed until just then. "Nancy made these for you, that I might help with whatever you're going through." I frowned. "I'm sorry, Dave. I'm not sure I know what you're talking about." He held up a hand unapologetically. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to pry. We've just seen you and Hannah a bit less than usual, and when we do see you, we can tell there's something troubling you. We've tried to wave a few times, but I think you've been so wound up in your own world to notice, which is fine," he added quickly. "We don't take any offense. We just wanted to let you know that we're here for both of you if ever the need arises." I was touched, nearly to the point of tears. "Thank you, Dave," I told him. "That's very kind." I took the plate and was about to shut the door when he stopped me. "There's something else I wanted to talk to you about," he said in a low, conspiratory voice. Behind me, I heard the faintest creak of a door opening down the hallway. It matched Dave's low tone. "What is it?" This is going to sound a bit crazy, so please know that I wouldn't say this if I hadn't seen it for myself. But sometimes me and Nancy think we can see a woman standing in your upstairs window. I could feel the moisture leave my throat. "I'm sorry? I don't think it's Hannah. This woman is rail thin, very unhealthy. You don't have anyone else living here, do you?" I shook my head. "No. I was afraid of that," Dave said. He looked around, feeling the same sense of danger that I felt. Now here's the crazy part. And please know this comes from a place of love for you and your wife. But I don't think that woman we've seen in your window is human. She just doesn't seem right. It was then that Dave's neck snapped, tilting in an unnatural, jagged angle, and the plate of brownies fell from the pavement and shattered. I heard nothing at first, just the fast beating of my heart and the high-pitched hum of blood in my ears. Then all at once I heard the screaming. It came in stereo, from both behind me and from across the street. Nancy Peterson had watched the scene from her doorstep, and Hannah had seen from behind me. I slammed the door shut and whirled around. Hannah had indeed been standing behind me, and behind her, wearing the same crocheting grin that I'd seen the second night she stayed with us, stood Sarah. Her hair fell on her face in twisted knots, and although her mouth had been shaped in a crescent moon of lunatic joy, her eyes were like that of a corpse. "He shouldn't have said those things," Sarah said tonelessly. "They always think those things." Hannah continued screaming. Her arms and hands shaking, she looked at Sarah and then at me. And that look told me far more than it should have. It told me she had helplessly remembered that night and every night leading up to it, which would be her demise. The screaming stopped abruptly, or at least the sound had. Hannah's throat still flexed and her veins still stood out on her neck, but no sound escaped her throat. "Sarah," I began, but I suddenly lost my voice as well, and all I could choke out was a dry wheeze. "She was never as good at the game as you were, was she?" she asked in the same toneless voice. She would sing songs, trying to keep me out, but eventually her thoughts would trickle through, and her dreams. "What are you talking about?" I thought to Sarah, still unable to speak but knowing she could hear me. "Don't pretend, Daddy. She told you everything. She poisoned my food last night, dumped me in the desert and left me to rot, and told everyone that I'd simply gone missing. Everyone but you, that is. You helped her do it. You helped her carry me to the desert and left me there to rot." Sarah closed her eyes, and for a moment her hold on Hannah's throat waned and my wife was allowed a final, ear-splitting cry. And then she was gone, just like Preston Jarvis. Hannah, my wife, and Sarah's mother had been erased from existence. I fell to my knees and began to sob. Sarah approaching me slowly, then knelt down and pressed her lips on my ear. Her breath was hot and putrid, the scent of rotting meat that I would later find in the form of a half-eaten bird in her bedroom. "I won't take her away for you like I did Preston's parents. You don't deserve that. Instead, I'll leave her in your mind, but only just enough to know you've forgotten." I looked up and met her eyes for the last time, seeing nothing but two black, hateful pupils. And then Sarah was gone as well, and I was alone. I didn't allow myself to think about it then, and wouldn't allow myself until long after the feeling of dread had lifted from the house. But when it had, I felt a wave of regret and love crash onto me like a freight train. My wife hadn't been able to keep Sarah out, and she'd known it. She couldn't keep Sarah from finding out the truth, but she could keep her from finding out the whole truth. She'd twisted things around enough to give me a chance for mercy, to allow Sarah to believe that Hannah had been the instigator and had only involved me after it was too late, which I know I don't deserve. The police did come eventually to collect Dave's body from my porch. A passing jogger had seen his corpse lying on my porch and called 911. Even though his wife had seen what happened, had screamed his name as he fell to the ground, she told police that the last thing she remembered was having her husband take brownies to her neighbors, and that she'd been unaware of the fact that he lay dead in plain view right across the street. I'm inclined to believe her story, because I've seen what Sarah can do, and perhaps that was Sarah's way of granting mercy. With every breath I take, I can feel more and more of my wife's memory slip away. I know it's still there, somewhere deep in my mind, but trying to recall things about her is becoming harder and harder, like trying to recall a dream after waking up. The features of her face are becoming distorted, blurry, and the memories we shared, our first kiss, our first date, our wedding night, are being blanketed by a haze I know will never be lifted. Sarah isn't gone, not like the others. I can still feel her presence, and I know it's only a matter of time until she returns home again. So if you find yourself unable to recall the face of a loved one, or if you feel a prickling sensation on the nape of your neck while you sit alone in your bedroom, if you find yourself awake in the middle of the night with a sense of dread hanging over you, know that it may be Sarah, and keep your thoughts guarded. She'll be listening.